The winter morning arrived pale and breathless, its cold light trembling across the empty plains as if unsure where to settle. Snow had fallen through most of the night, soft and heavy, covering the land in a kind of hush, a silence that pressed against the skin. When the stagecoach groaned to a stop beside the lonely frontier station, the horses snorted steam into the air, and the door opened with the weary sigh of old metal surrendering to the weather. From it stepped a young woman wrapped in a thin blue coat meant for gentler winters. Eli Weston paused on the last step, looking at the endless white landscape, her breath catching as though she were stepping not into a new life, but into the mouth of something unknown and waiting. She held a small carpetbag close to her chest, knuckles white from the cold. Folded inside that bag, beneath 2 dresses and a worn prayer book, were letters written in neat, hopeful handwriting. Letters from a man she had never met, a man who promised land and companionship, and a future built brick by brick with patience. Elias Turner, rancher, age 27, searching for a bride who could offer steadiness. She had believed him. She had believed his quiet words, his talk of hearth smoke and soft evenings and fields ready for planting. Believed them enough to leave everything behind. Now the sky above felt too large, too empty, and her heartbeat scattered like startled birds. A lone figure approached from the side of the station, boots crunching through the snow. Eli recognized him from the photograph he had mailed. A narrow-faced man with sandy hair and a posture that suggested he was always bracing for something. Elias looked even smaller in person, swallowed by his coat and dwarfed by the vast horizon. His eyes flicked over Eli not with curiosity or even disappointment, but with something colder, sharper, an appraisal that took from her rather than gave. "So you're her," he murmured, voice low, the words swallowed by the wind before they could fully land. He didn't smile. Didn't offer help with her luggage. He didn't even meet her gaze long enough for her to speak the greeting she had practiced all the way from Missouri. She tried again, offering a soft hello, but he shifted backward, almost recoiling, as if the sight of her grief-lined exhaustion was too heavy for him to carry. He said he was sorry, though his tone made it sound like a blame rather than an apology. Said his ranch wasn't ready for a woman. Said he hadn't expected her to look so worn from travel. Said she should understand. And then he said nothing else. Just turned away, adjusting his gloves, as if this moment had already been folded and stored somewhere out of sight. His rejection struck like a whip, quiet, thin, and painfully precise. Eli felt something inside her unspool. The cold deepened its hold on her lungs. She stood there beside the coach, feeling the world tilt, feeling every promise made to her fall apart in slow motion. She wanted to speak, to ask if she had done something wrong, if the journey had changed her too much, if she should have smiled brighter, spoken faster, looked softer. But the words tangled behind her ribs, and Elias was already walking away. A shadow shifted near the hitching rail. Eli hadn't noticed anyone else when she arrived, but now she saw him, a tall, broad man standing beside a bay horse, his dark hair loose around his shoulders, chest bare beneath an unbuttoned hide jacket despite the winter cold. His skin carried the warmth of the earth, and his eyes were steady in a way that made the world seem less chaotic. An Apache man, unmistakably so. And yet there was something in the way he watched her, not with intrusion or judgment, but with a steady, measured compassion, like he had seen storms like hers before and knew how long they could last. He didn't speak. He just held her gaze for a moment that stretched gently between them, offering nothing but presence. It was enough to make her breathe again. A small thing but real. Mrs. Lorna Pike came bustling from the boarding house across the yard, wool shawl flapping in the wind. "Oh, honey," she said, as soon as she saw Eli's face. "Come inside. Warm yourself." Elias had already disappeared beyond the station, leaving only footprints that the wind was quickly erasing. Mrs. Pike took Eli's arm with the firmness of a woman who had rescued more than a few lost souls over the years, guiding her across the icy ground. Eli let herself be pulled, her steps slow, as if her body resisted moving into a future she hadn't planned. Behind them, the tall Apache man remained still. She felt his attention linger, not in acclaim, not in curiosity, but in something quieter, something like witness. As though he understood the way a life could change between one breath and the next. As though he recognized the strength it took for someone to keep walking, when every dream had just cracked like thin ice. Inside the boarding house, warmth wrapped around Eli like a blanket, carrying the smell of wood smoke and frying cornbread. Mrs. Pike settled her near the stove, pressing a mug of hot water with mint leaves into her hands. "Drink slow. Warm your bones." Eli nodded, murmuring thank you, though her voice trembled. Her fingers were numb, but it was the numbness inside her chest that frightened her more. Through the window she could see the white world stretching endlessly, the wind painting swirls across the snow. The hitching rail stood dark and lonely against the pale morning. The tall Apache man had not moved far. He was adjusting the reins of his horse, muscles shifting beneath bronze skin, breath steady despite the cold. But what struck her most was this. Every so often, he looked back toward the boarding house door, as if making sure she was still there, still safe, still not swallowed by the winter. Eli clutched her mug tighter, a strange warmth rising beneath the cold ache of rejection. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he had watched her like that, didn't know what it meant. She only knew this winter morning had opened like a wound, and yet, at the edge of its bitterness, something unexpected waited. Quiet, patient, and shaped like the silhouette of a man who did not turn away. She had come west believing she would belong to one life. She did not yet understand she had stepped into another entirely. But she felt it, faint as a flicker in a snowstorm, when the man outside lifted his eyes toward the window once more and held her gaze through the glass, steady as a promise not yet spoken. The first night in the boarding house passed in restless fragments. Eli lay beneath a quilt stitched with fading blue stars, listening to the wind nudge the shutters and whistle along the cracks of the old wooden frame. Each breath she drew felt hollow. Not empty, but echoing, like she had become a house with no furniture left inside. She tried to sleep. Tried to picture the home Elias had described in his letters. The little stone hearth, the corral he promised to build, the porch swing he said he wanted someday. But each image dissolved like sand when touched. She turned toward the window instead, toward the faint glow of dawn brushing the sky with pale rose light. Somewhere out there, snow softened the world, but she knew it could not soften the truth she had walked into. When she finally stepped outside, the cold greeted her with a sharp kiss. The snow had crusted overnight, a thin, glittering shell on top, crunching beneath her boots. She headed for the pump to wash the sleep from her face, and maybe some of the ache from her chest. Her fingers curled around the iron handle, breath clouding before her, and she forced the pump down again, until water sputtered out in thin, icy streams. She splashed her face quickly, not wanting the cold to settle too deep, but the water still stung like tiny shards against her skin. She leaned forward, letting droplets slide down her cheeks, refusing to wonder if they mingled with tears. She didn't want to cry anymore. She didn't want to play the fragile girl abandoned in the snow. A soft crunch of footsteps behind her made her straighten, but she didn't turn yet. She sensed him before she saw him. The quiet weight of his presence, the kind that didn't demand attention but offered it. When she finally looked over her shoulder, she found the tall Apache man standing a few paces away, his breath steady in the cold, his gaze deep as winter earth. He held a clay cup in one hand, steam curling upward in gentle ribbons. Without speaking, he extended it toward her. She hesitated. Not out of fear. There was nothing frightening in the way he stood, no sharpness in his posture, no expectation in his eyes. She hesitated because kindness was the one thing she did not know how to accept this morning. But he didn't push the cup closer. He simply held it there, a quiet offering, as though he were placing warmth itself into her hands. She finally reached out. Her fingers brushed his for the briefest instant, and she felt the surprising heat of his skin, the strength beneath it. The cup warmed her palms immediately. She lifted it toward her lips and tasted fennel and smoke, a soothing mix. She whispered thank you, her voice thin, unsure if he even heard. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, as though acknowledging not just the words but everything behind them. "You don't have to act with me," he said quietly, his tone shaped by deep calm rather than softness. His voice held both gravity and gentleness, as if he chose each word with care, as if he understood the way they could land on a fragile heart. The sentence fell between them like a blanket, warm and unexpected. Eli froze. Her fingers tightened around the cup. She had not realized she had been acting, straightening her shoulders, holding her chin high, pretending the rejection did not still sit in her bones. But he had seen it, all of it, with a single glance. When she didn't speak, he tilted his head just enough to show he wasn't asking for answers, simply offering truth. Then he stepped back, giving her room to breathe again. She watched him turn toward the hitching rail where his horse waited. A beautiful bay with a black mane that shimmered in the cold light. The man adjusted the saddle strap, moving with a quiet grace that made even the wind seem loud by comparison. Eli didn't know why she kept watching him. Maybe because everyone else in town had looked at her with pity or curiosity or something colder. Maybe because he alone had stood steady, offering neither judgment nor intrusion. Or maybe because his one simple sentence had cracked something open inside her, something she had tried too hard to seal shut. Mrs. Pike bustled out of the boarding house, cheeks pink from the stove. "Oh good, you're up," she said, brushing snow off her apron. "Jonah's been waitin' to show you his carvings." Eli offered a small smile, grateful for the distraction. The child was waiting on the porch, a little boy with wild curls and a grin too large for his tiny face. He held up a wooden horse proudly. "Made it myself," he declared. "Wants to run, he does." Eli knelt beside him, admiring the crooked legs and uneven body. Even in its imperfections, there was something sincere and bright about it. She followed Jonah around the yard, listening to his stories. Every so often, she sensed eyes on her. Not intrusive, just aware. When she glanced back toward the hitching rail, the tall man was watching her quietly as he tightened rope ties. But when she caught his gaze, he didn't look away. His eyes held no embarrassment, only patience, as though studying weather patterns rather than people. After a while, he mounted his horse with the fluid ease of someone who had spent more hours in a saddle than on the ground. Mrs. Pike called out to him. "Mornin', Dakota." He lifted a hand in greeting, and Eli stored the name in the private corner of her mind. Dakota. She didn't know what it meant, but it fit the way he moved, the way he seemed rooted and unshaken by whatever storms passed through the land or the hearts of people living upon it. As he rode away, Eli felt a strange tightness in her chest, not painful, just noticeable, like a string being tugged lightly from somewhere she hadn't realized a string could exist. Inside, Jonah begged her to sit by the stove and read him a story, and she allowed herself to be folded into the simple rhythm of the morning. The warmth of the room, the soft crackle of burning wood, the sound of the child's breathing as he leaned against her shoulder. They created a cocoon she didn't know she needed. But her mind wandered. Again and again, she returned to the moment by the pump, to the steam rising from the cup, to the steady gaze that had seen her without asking for anything in return. By midday, whispers began circling through the town. Women walking past the boarding house cast glances that weren't unkind, but prickled with curiosity. Eli heard her name once, then twice. Someone mentioned the stagecoach arrival. Someone else murmured about Elias Turner's sudden change of heart. Another whispered the Apache man's name, and how he had been standing nearby when Eli was left alone in the snow. Eli tucked herself deeper into her coat as she stepped outside for air, feeling the weight of eyes she had never asked to bear. She wandered toward the back of the yard, where the snow had drifted against the fence in soft, uneven waves. The wind brushed her hair across her cheek, cold and light. She leaned her hands against the railing, staring at the distant fields, trying to find direction in the wide, open land. A quiet step stopped beside her. Dakota didn't speak at first. He simply stood in silence, letting the wind pass between them. His presence felt like a shield, not from danger but from the sharp edge of the world's regard. "People talk," she murmured, eyes fixed on the horizon. "They always will," he answered. "But their words do not make your path." She swallowed hard. "What path do I have left?" "The one you walk," he said, not missing a beat. "Even if it begins in hurt." She turned then, looking up at him. His eyes held no pity, only recognition, as if he had walked through the same storm she was stumbling through now. For the first time all day, Eli felt the ground beneath her feet steady. And just when she thought she might breathe easily again, Dakota's gaze shifted past her, toward the road leading into town. Eli followed his eyes. Far off, a lone rider approached, coat flapping behind him like a dark wing. Elias Turner was coming back. Elias Turner rode into town with the same stiff posture he had worn earlier, as though he were bracing himself against a truth he didn't want to face. His horse snorted clouds of steam, hooves cracking the icy road. Eli felt her breath tighten as he approached, though she tried to hide the way her fingers curled into the fence rail. The bitter morning light glinted off the metal of his stirrups, each reflective flash a reminder of how quickly a dream could turn into something jagged. He dismounted with an awkward clatter, his boots slipping slightly on the frozen ground, and she wondered, strangely distantly, if he even saw the irony in returning after telling her she wasn't what he wanted. He stopped a few paces away, chest rising with the kind of bravado that only insecurity builds. "Eli," he said, lifting his chin. "I reckon I may be spoken too fast." His tone was flat, the apology thin as ice forming on a trough. He looked at her coat, her posture, her face, as if checking whether she still matched the version he had once imagined. "You came all this way," he added, voice dropping as though he expected her to thank him for reconsidering. "Town talks, you know. Folks say it weren't right to leave you out in the cold like that. I'm willing to reevaluate things." Eli felt a tremor she hoped he'd mistake for cold. Every word cut deeper, not in the way of blades, but in the way of a dull knife scraping bone. A kindness offered for the sake of reputation was not kindness at all. She steadied herself, lifting her gaze. "Elias, I don't belong where I'm not chosen." Her voice was soft, barely more than breath, yet the words felt heavier than the winter sky. Elias blinked, taken aback, then forced a tight smile that held no warmth. "Suit yourself," he muttered, though she could hear the sting beneath the surface. He tugged at his gloves again, the gesture nervous, almost childish, before he spun back toward his horse. But before he could mount, his eyes flicked past her shoulder, and Eli felt rather than heard Dakota's approach. Quiet steps sinking into snow, the low crunch of weight settling into the frozen earth. Elias's face tightened, his jaw locking like a trap. "The Apache again," he muttered under his breath, though Eli was certain Dakota heard. He always heard what people wished he hadn't. Dakota didn't move closer than he needed to. He simply stood near enough to make it clear she wasn't standing alone. Eli didn't know how, but his presence seemed to build a wall against the cold Elias carried with him. Words didn't pass between them. None were needed. Elias mounted up in a flurry of irritation, as though her refusal and Dakota's silent witness had somehow collided into a bruise he didn't know how to hide. When he rode off, the winter wind swallowed him quickly, leaving behind only a restless quiet. Eli exhaled slowly, the breath shaking loose a tension she hadn't realized she'd held. Dakota glanced at her, not asking, not assuming, simply watching with the patience of someone who understood that wounds didn't always bleed where others could see. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The moment passed between them like a small ember pressed into cold hands. The day dragged into gray light, the clouds hanging heavy like unspoken doubts. Whispers drifted through town as Eli walked toward the mercantile with Mrs. Pike. Conversations dipped when she passed, gentle murmurs, though their sweetness held edges. "Poor thing. Rejected twice now. Shame about Elias. Shame about her. Shame about, well, you know." Eli's cheeks burned despite the cold. She stared straight ahead, each breath growing tighter, each step more deliberate. Inside the store, warmth rose from the iron stove, sinning the edges of her coat. Jonah tugged her sleeve, begging her to look at the colored candies in the jar, and she bent to humor him, grateful for something bright in a room that suddenly felt too narrow. But the whispers followed her to the back of the store, circling like hungry birds. She didn't meet their eyes. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply each careless word salted the rawness of her heart. Dakota stepped inside a few minutes later, shoulders brushing the cold from the doorway. His presence altered the room's air, though not in the way loud men do. Everything simply steadied. Even the gossips softened their voices, though curiosity sparkled like frost along their expressions. He moved past the shelves with slow certainty, selecting supplies without glancing at anyone, but Eli knew he was aware of the way the town watched them both. When their paths crossed near the counter, he paused. "You endure more than you speak," he said quietly, voice low enough for only her to hear. She swallowed, stunned by how simply he named the truth she tried to hide beneath polite smiles. "I don't know what else to do," she whispered. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering her words from multiple angles. "Sometimes the quietest path is the strongest," he replied. "But quiet should not mean alone." Something in her chest tightened, not in pain, but in a kind of recognition she wasn't ready to name. She managed a small nod before turning to collect Jonah. Dakota lingered just long enough to ensure she felt seen, then stepped aside, giving her space to breathe. That evening, the boarding house felt unusually restless. The wind pressed against the walls in slow, tired waves, and the lamps flickered with every draft. Eli helped Mrs. Pike peel potatoes in the kitchen, though her thoughts drifted over the day's bruisings. Each rejection, each whispered judgment, each moment of being misunderstood stacked upon one another like icy stones in her stomach. Mrs. Pike sensed the heaviness but didn't pry. Instead, she hummed an old lullaby, gentle and slow, its melody curling around the kitchen like a quilt. It wasn't until later, near dusk, that the fire accident occurred. Jonah, playful and forgetful, knocked over a kindling basket while running. Flames leapt with surprising speed, eating at the dry straw. Eli shouted for him to stay back, but he froze, tiny body trembling in the orange glow. Before she could move, Dakota burst through the doorway from outside, arms cutting through smoke like wine through tall grass. He scooped Jonah into his arms with one sure motion, shielding him as embers scattered across the floor. He set the boy safely beside Eli, then returned to stomp out the flames with calm precision, as though he had done this 100 times before. By the time Mrs. Pike arrived, breathless, the danger had passed, leaving only scorch marks on the boards, and the sharp smell of smoke lingering in the air. Eli knelt to inspect Jonah, brushing soot from his cheeks. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what might have been. When she lifted her gaze, Dakota was watching her with the kind of steady warmth that made her breath catch. His hand bore a burn along the palm, reddened and raw. She reached for him instinctively, fingers trembling as they touched his injured skin. He did not pull away. He only watched her, expression unreadable, as though he were studying not the pain but the tenderness of her touch. The moment held them both in its quiet gravity, deep and unspoken. And then the door creaked open behind them. Eli turned. Elias stood there again, this time with something colder than doubt in his eyes. Elias stood in the doorway as if carved from the winter itself, rigid, sharp-edged, carrying a cold that seeped deeper than the wind outside. His eyes flicked from Eli to Dakota's injured hand, then to Jonah trembling beside the hearth. Something tightened in his expression, a mix of jealousy, wounded pride, and a bitterness that sought somewhere to land. Eli rose slowly, dusting ash from her skirt, though her pulse knocked against her ribs. She could feel Dakota's presence behind her, not looming, not shielding, just steadying her in a way that gave her enough strength to stand upright in the face of whatever Elias had carried back with him. "I came to talk," Elias said, though the words sounded like accusations barely disguised as concern. Mrs. Pike stepped forward, tone firm as hammered iron. "Not here, Elias." The child's shaken. "Another time." But Elias ignored her, stepping farther into the room. His boots left slush trails across the floorboards, each mark a reminder that he had once been invited into a future Eli no longer wanted. Eli lifted her chin, quiet but resolved. "Elias, this isn't the moment." He studied her, confusion flickering beneath the defensive anger. "I just want to make things right," he said. But even he seemed unsure of what right meant anymore. His gaze drifted to Dakota, and something bitter twisted his features. "Folks are saying things, Eli. About you and him." He spat the last word as if naming Dakota were an offense. "You're making a spectacle of yourself. After what I offered you after rejecting me," Eli said softly. But the softness held the strength of a glacier, quiet, immovable. Elias flinched, then tried again, his voice thinning. You're ruining your chances. This town's got a long memory." Dakota didn't move, but the firelight caught the lines of his shoulders, the calm in his stance. His silence said what Eli didn't know how to express, that a future built from fear was no future at all. Elias took a breath, prepared to insist again, but Mrs. Pike stepped sharply between them and shooed him out with more force than her age suggested. The door slammed behind him, rattling dust from the rafters. The room exhaled in his absence. Jonah clung to Eli, small arms squeezing her waist, and she bent to kiss the top of his smoke-scented curls. When she rose, Dakota met her eyes with a question. Unspoken, patient. Eli stepped closer and took his burned hand again, guiding him toward the table where the lamplight formed a golden pool. "Sit," she murmured, already reaching for the salve jar Mrs. Pike kept near the stove. Dakota obeyed without resistance, and Eli knelt before him, brushing soot from the ridges of his palm. The burn was angry, red, blistering at the edges. She smoothed the salve gently, careful not to worsen the pain. He didn't flinch, but his gaze remained fixed on her face with a quiet intensity that made the air feel warmer. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew gratitude was far too small a word. He lifted his other hand and brushed a stray curl from her cheek, the gesture tender, unhurried. "You carry too much alone," he said. His voice held no judgment, only understanding. Eli's throat tightened. "I don't know how not to," she admitted. His thumb paused against her cheek, resting there like a promise. "You learn," he said softly. "The heart learns in quiet." The words sank into her like warm water seeping into cold earth. She finished tending his hand and rose, suddenly aware of the trembling in her knees. Outside, the wind moaned, brushing against the eaves like a restless spirit searching for a door. Mrs. Pike sent Jonah to bed and gave Eli a knowing look, one threaded with both worry and approval. Then she left them alone by the stove, trusting the silence to say what words weren't ready to carry. Dakota shifted, standing tall, his presence filling the room without overpowering it. Eli wrapped her arms around herself, half from the cold, half from the fluttering stirring inside her. "Do you walk in the evenings?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "When the world feels too loud." His lips curved slightly, almost a smile. "Then walk with me." They stepped outside into the night, the cold biting but bearable. Snowflakes drifted lazily, gathering on Dakota's hair and shoulders, sparkling like tiny stars caught in dark strands. The road stretched quiet and empty, lined with fences half buried in drifts. Eli walked beside him, their pace slow, the rhythm as natural as breathing. She spoke of her childhood, of long days helping her father mend tools and long nights sewing by candlelight. She spoke of loneliness that clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Dakota listened without interrupting, his silence a deeper comfort than any words could offer. When she faltered, admitting fears she had never dared speak aloud, fear of being unwanted, of being too much, of being not enough, he stopped walking. The snow whispered around them as he turned to face her fully. "Eli," he said gently, the wind catching her name like a fragile thing, "you survived more than most could. You crossed a continent with hope as thin as paper. That is not weakness. That is courage." Her breath caught. No one had ever said such words to her, not with meaning, not with truth. She felt something inside her thaw, a piece of herself she hadn't even known was frozen. They continued walking, their shoulders brushing once, then again, until it felt natural, inevitable. When they returned to the yard, the lantern hanging on the porch swayed gently, casting shifting shadows across the snow. Eli felt lighter somehow, as though the night had carried away something she no longer needed. She turned to Dakota, intending to thank him again, but he spoke first. "Elias won't let this go," he said, eyes steady. His words held no fear, only clarity. Eli nodded, the truth settling like cold air in her lungs. "I know. But I can't let him shape my life. Not again." Dakota studied her, the faint glow catching the amber flecks in his eyes. "You're braver than you think," he murmured. Then, after a long pause, he added, "And you don't have to face him alone." The lantern flickered, wind pushing the flames sideways. Eli opened her mouth to speak, but a sudden shout cut through the stillness, a voice filled with anger, coming from the edge of the yard, echoing across the snow in sharp, jagged waves. Eli felt her stomach drop as she recognized it immediately. Elias had returned again, this time not to argue or plead. This time he was calling her name like a threat. Eli froze at the sound of Elias's voice, its rough edge slicing through the stillness like a blade pulled too quickly from its sheath. Snow crackled beneath Dakota's boots as he stepped instinctively in front of her, not blocking her from the world, but placing himself between her and its sharpness. The lantern light trembled on the porch, casting a wavering halo across the yard where Elias stood, coat flapping, breath heaving, anger burning bright as if he had fed it all evening until it blazed out of control. "Eli!" he barked, her name snapping through the air. "You come out here right now." His hand gripped his reins so tightly the leather creaked. She felt the old urge to shrink, to fold in on herself like a paper bird in rain, but she forced her shoulders to stay level. Takota's presence steadied her like a hand pressed softly between her shoulder blades. When she stepped forward, he stepped with her, their breath mingling in the cold. Elias's eyes darted between them, widening with something wild. "So that's it then?" he snapped. "You throw yourself at the first man who looks at you?" His words struck with a cruel precision that made Eli inhale sharply, not from truth but from the sting of someone trying to write her story without permission. Takota's voice cut through the moment, quiet, even, but carrying a weight that stilled the wind itself. "Enough!" Elias turned to him, fury igniting. "You keep out of this. She is my business." Takota didn't flinch. "She belongs to herself," he replied, each syllable firm as earth. Eli felt the truth settle into her bones like warmth returning to cold hands. For a moment the world shrank to only the three of them, breath rising like smoke, snow swirling around boots and fence posts. Elias stepped forward, fist clenched, eyes glossy with wounded pride masquerading as righteousness. "I gave you a chance, Eli. I try to make this right. But you—" His voice cracked, just once, but he buried the tremor beneath anger. "You make me look a fool in front of everyone." Eli's voice emerged steady, shaped by every quiet moment she'd shared with Takota, every truth he had drawn from her without ever demanding it. "Elias, you're not a fool because of me. You're a fool because you think a woman is something you can summon, or discard when it suits you." Her breath fogged the air between them. "I won't go with you. Not now. Not ever." For a heartbeat Elias did not move. Then he lunged, not at her but toward Takota, fury boiling over. Takota shifted with a swiftness born not of violence but of instinct, stepping aside, grabbing Elias's arm, turning the momentum away from Eli. The motion was fluid, almost gentle, but final enough to send Elias stumbling into the snow, breath knocked from his lungs. Before he could rise again, the sound of boots approached, the sheriff's voice ringing out through the dark. "That's enough, Turner." Sheriff Amos moved toward them, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Heard your shouting halfway down Main Street. This ends now." Elias sputtered, pointing at Eli, at Takota, at the sky itself. "She humiliated me. And he—" Sheriff Amos raised a gloved hand. "I don't give a damn about your pride. You threatened a woman. You stormed into a yard twice. And you're done here. You leave tonight." Elias stared, disbelief cracking across his features. "You can't." The sheriff's hand moved to his holster. "Try me." Silence swallowed the yard. Elias's breath shook as he looked at Eli again. But whatever fight remained in him drained like water through cracked soil. He mounted his horse with stiff movements, glare flicking between them one last time. "You'll regret this, Eli," he spat. And then he rode into the winter darkness, swallowed by falling snow. When the sheriff left, the yard felt startlingly empty, as if the night were inhaling after holding its breath too long. Eli sagged, the adrenaline slipping from her limbs. Her knees buckled, but Takota was there before she fell, arms steady, warm, a shelter she never expected to find. She pressed her hands against his chest, feeling the slow, grounding rhythm of his heartbeat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not even sure what she apologized for. Perhaps the fear, the chaos, the wasted hope she had once pinned to Elias's name. Takota shook his head gently. "Do not apologize for surviving," he murmured. Her breath hitched, not from fear now, but from the softness in his voice. She stepped back just enough to meet his eyes, deep, steady, filled with something she had felt growing like a quiet flame from the first morning he had handed her a cup of warm water. The wind softened, snow drifting like down around them. Eli swallowed. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted. His gaze dropped to her hands still clinging to his shirt. "Whatever you choose," he said. But his voice trembled, just barely. "There is something I must say, before another storm rises. She held her breath, sensing the world narrowing to the space between them. The lantern light flickered, casting gold across his cheekbones. Dakota exhaled slowly, as if freeing something long contained. Eli, from the moment I saw you crying at the pump, I saw not brokenness, but courage. And I knew, his voice deepened, unsteady, that my heart was already moving toward yours. Her lips parted, a small sound escaping, part disbelief, part yearning. Dakota stepped closer, the warmth of him a contrast to the winter pressing against her back. I have loved you quietly, he said, like someone holding a fragile thing in both hands, afraid to crush it. I thought silence was safer. But I cannot stay silent anymore. Eli felt tears rise, warm and unexpected. She lifted her trembling fingertips to his face, brushing snow from his jaw. I thought no one would ever want me after everything. Dakota caught her hands in his. Want you? He whispered. You were never unwanted. You were only unseen by men who could not recognize your worth. Something inside her broke open then, not with pain, but with release. She leaned toward him until their foreheads touched, breath mingling. May I? He whispered, asking without expecting. She nodded against him, and he kissed her. Slow, reverent, like snowfall landing on still water. No hunger. No urgency. Only truth spoken in the language of touch. When they drew apart, the world felt changed. Eli looked up at him, cheeks flushed, heart trembling in her chest. I choose you, she whispered. Not because I am lost, but because I am finally found. Dakota closed his eyes briefly, as though her words sank deeper than any wound he had known. And when he opened them again, something fierce and beautiful stirred there, a vow without sound. The wind shifted, and from the edge of town, a distant lantern flickered, moving toward them through the dark, bringing with it something Eli had not yet imagined, something that would test everything they had just spoken aloud.